Welcome, dear listeners, to another chilling tale. In the dim glow of flickering candles, a group of friends dared to unlock the secrets of the supernatural, their hands trembling over a restless Ouija board. Unfortunately, they would unleash spectral entities that held a chilling connection to a tragic past, a past eager to claim the living for sins they did not commit. My family hasn't been closely knit for a very long time, particularly on my father's side. Until just the last few years, I hadn't seen any of my cousins, aunts, or uncles from that side of the family since I was probably about 13 years old, almost 20 years ago. Over the last few years, however, my father has become heavily involved in researching our family's history. Out of that endeavor has sprung an annual family reunion, which we've had every year for the last 2 or 3. I'd be lying if I said the first couple of times were anything short of awkward. As I said, I haven't seen any of them since I was a child. Now, as a grown adult, I found myself reintegrated into a family that I barely knew. In a few cases, I still can't even get their names straight. I had nothing in common with and nothing to talk about with them. My cousin Josh was probably the single exception to this, but even he was a completely different person from the kid I'd known, as was I to him, no doubt. So for the first 2 years, I mostly stuck with my immediate family near the alcohol and sat in uncomfortable silence. A few weeks ago, we had what I think was our 3rd annual reunion. This time, probably in large part thanks to my recent penchant for dredging up long-forgotten memories from what has become a rather fuzzy childhood, I made a deliberate effort to establish communication with my cousin Carl. The alcohol may have played a small hand as well. Who can say? This conversation turned out to be easy, satisfying, and much more enlightening than I could have hoped. We discussed shared childhood events, including those detailed in The Dead Children of Camp Redwood, Ghouls in the Graveyard, and Eyes from Beyond, among others. Several events came up over the course of this discussion, and in the further discussions we've had in our continued communications since. I'd almost completely forgotten about them, that is, until he brought them up, and then it all came flooding back. This story takes place in a house within which, as I look back now, I always felt unsafe. I don't know if I blocked out most of my memories from that house, but what I do know is that I had not thought of it in a very long time, and over the last few weeks, speaking with my cousin Carl has opened a door of memories, some absolutely horrifying, as well as possibly having opened a floodgate of paranormal activity. The night on which the following events occurred started off as quiet. It was a summer evening in the turbulent era that followed my parents' divorce. My mother had gotten the house, a rather large old house which sat in a small thicket of woods in a fairly populous suburban area. The area was by no means remote, but by comparison to the others in the neighborhood, my house sort of was. My father was off in his new apartment, and my mother was constantly working into the early hours of the morning, doing her best to support the family. My oldest sister was rarely home, and my other, also older sister, was living on her own with her boyfriend. That left my brother Brandon and me, both very young, alone in the house almost every night. On this occasion, being midsummer, we'd managed to round up some company. My cousin Carl and one of my brother's friends named Russell had come over and were hanging out, deciding what they wanted to do. Eventually, they decided they were going to walk up to our old neighborhood to see some friends, leaving me behind as my older brother didn't want me tagging along. So, they left. I was alone a lot as a kid. But only in this particular house do I remember ever feeling the need to round up an arsenal of weaponry with which to protect myself. I would empty virtually the entire contents of the silverware drawer onto the couch next to me, forks, steak knives, butter knives, with which I made Wolverine claws. I had gone through the same ritual on this very night and sat down with my Wolverine claws prepared to watch some television, X-Files, I think, back when it was scary. Before long, the peaceful summer night turned into a raging storm. The rain beat on the roof like a stampede of infinite horses, and the sound of distant thunder grew louder. The power started to flicker, threatening to throw me into a world of darkness, and I huddled closer to my stockpile of murderous butter knives. Suddenly, there came a furious pounding on the front door. I was frightened, not knowing who could possibly be at the door, but at the same time, the thought of being alone in the house scared me so much that I didn't care. I ran to the window, creeping up slowly as I neared it in order not to be seen. I slipped the curtain aside carefully and looked through the window. It was pouring outside, however, and a sheet of rain roared across the glass, collecting here and there in thick rivulets so that I couldn't see anything outside. The darkness of the night and the surrounding trees did their part to impede my vision as well. Suddenly, a blinding flash of light illuminated the world outside. Through the flowing water, I was able to make out the shape of two figures standing on my porch. Crouched low to the ground, I watched as they swayed back and forth just outside the door. They looked like trolls or garden gnomes. The knocking came again, this time a bit angrier. "Let us in!" a voice growled from outside of the door. I clenched my Wolverine claw-wielding fist. "Sean, let me in or I'll kill you!" It only took a moment for me to recognize my brother's voice, and another moment to let him into the house along with Carl and Russell. In another moment still, I was being pelted with wet fists. "Why didn't you open the door?" they said. I thought you were garden gnomes." Time ticked by with all of us sat inside the house, me happy to have some company and them unhappy to be back home. The power wavered once more, and even the older boys held their breath. The storm was vicious and showed no signs of letting up. "Oh man, you guys," Carl said suddenly, jumping to his feet. "I have a great idea." We all turned our attention towards him. "Let's play with the Ouija board." Of course, as was almost always the case with Carl, this idea was both terribly bad yet well received. We all ran around in excitement, gathering up candles, blankets, pillows, and of course the Ouija board. Allow me to set the stage a little before we get too far in. We'll be back on track shortly, but to add to the picture, as well as not to slow down the pacing later, I think it's important that we get it out of the way. When you first walked into the front door, there was a wide and open landing area just before the stairs that led up to the second floor. To the left, through a wide archway, was the dining room. Through the dining room on the right was the door to the long, narrow kitchen, which had a door on the left leading outside and on the right, a door down into the basement. Back at the main entrance, if you made a right through another wide archway, you would enter the living room. As you entered, on your right was a large window, the one I'd looked out earlier in the story, in front of which sat the TV I'd been watching. On the left, across from the TV, was a long sofa, one of its 3 cushions supporting a pile of kitchen cutlery and eating utensils. Behind the sofa was a small area of the living room that was sort of sectioned off. It was about 8 feet from the back of the couch to the back wall of the living room, where another large window looked out on the backyard. Also in this section, on the wall to the left, was a closet, which was where the Ouija board had been kept. It was in this little nook behind the couch, in front of the closet, and below the backyard window, that we'd set up the board. We laid down a thick, comfy quilt and lined it with some pillows. Then we lit the candles around us in a crude circle before turning off the lights. With the thunder rumbling in the heavens, shaking the house upon its foundations, and the rain continuing its assault upon the roof, we began our session with the Ouija board. Due to limited finger space on the planchette, I was left out of the actual communication attempt and reduced to simply a spectator. But that was fine with me. I sat on my pillow, blanket wrapped about my shoulders, and watched as the others began their efforts to communicate with the dead. "If there are any spirits here with us tonight, we'd like to try and speak with you," said my cousin Carl, with his fingertips gently caressing the planchette. Nothing happened at first. For several minutes, similar statements were made, and various questions were asked, all of which evoked no response from the spirit board. More minutes passed, and the excitement had begun to fade as still nothing appeared to be happening. I sensed the others' enthusiasm beginning to falter and feared that the mood of the evening was about to be ruined. Suddenly, my brother's friend Russell shouted at the top of his voice, "Speak!" At that moment, the planchette leapt into the air about 3 inches off of the board. I recall now that I could plainly see the space between the board and the wooden piece. It was clearly airborne. Carl was on my left and my brother on my right, with both of their fingers completely visible to me. Russell sat across from me, however, with his back to the closet door. I couldn't see his fingers, and as he had been the one to shout, I was suspicious that he might have been behind the plant shot's sudden burst of activity. I kept my mouth shut, however, in an effort to sustain the atmosphere. The others had reeled back in fright in response to the sudden movement. Eventually, with an abundance of hesitance, the 3 resumed their prior position. "Is there someone here with us?" Carl asked. The board did not respond. My brother looked towards Russell. "You try," he said. Russell looked at him nervously, mouth agape but without argument. He turned his face back towards the board, closing his slack jaw to swallow the lump in his throat. Is anyone here with us?" Russell asked. I watched in awe as the planchette slowly began to move, creeping along towards the top of the board, which was in front of my brother near the edge of the board. Just before sliding off onto the quilt, it stopped. Through the circular window embedded into the wood, the word "yes" could be read. My brother's head quickly snapped up and looked towards Russell with a dubious expression on his face, as if to say, "You'd better not be doing this." In return, Russell shook his head. A look of fright spread across his own face as if to say, "It's not me." Still, I had my suspicions. Though the scared excitement had returned, Carl said to Russell, "Keep going." Russell asked the wood fang, "Do you have a name?" Again, it began to creep along, shuffling across the board on its felt shoes. It only moved this time in a small circle before coming to rest once more on the word "yes." Carl smirked. "Smartass," he said. "Well," Russell began, "what is—" The planchette suddenly lurched across the board, stopping briefly on the letter U, then slid off quickly to the letter N. Finally, at a pace much swifter than it had moved in answering the previous questions, it zipped over to the letter O, where it came to rest. We all cast nervous glances at one another before the inevitable accusations began. "Russell, come on, man. I know you're doing this," offered my brother. I threw my hat into the ring behind him as I did agree. Russell shook his head. "No, man, I swear. All I know is that it isn't me," said Carl. "So it's definitely one of you two. How come it's only answering to Russell, Brandon?" my brother asked. "Come on, Carl. He's got to be doing it." Carl looked towards Russell. "I swear it's not me, guys," Russell said, his voice cracking. He was visibly shaken. I don't know, dude," said Carl. "Look at him, he's terrified." "I am," Russell admitted. "I am terrified. I think we should stop." "No way," the other 3 of us agreed in unison. So after a timidly fought uphill battle against my brother and Carl, Russell resumed communication. "So, your name is Uno?" he asked. The planchette hurtled furiously across the board again towards my brother, with such speed it caused him to rock backward a bit. "No," it responded. It then began another circuit of the board, racing hurriedly and angrily from letter to letter once more, indicating the cryptic letters U, N, O this time. It didn't stop. However, it continued on. UNO, racing back and forth repeatedly. UNO, hissing and scraping across the board. UNO. Outside, the storm raged, and the sky was torn open with a ferocious roar. Russell could take no more. "Stop it!" he screamed at the top of his lungs, and to my astonishment, the planchette stopped, coming to rest upon the O, so that through the circular window it appeared as an eyeball staring us down maliciously. I felt suddenly very uneasy, now afraid that Russell was, in fact, not behind this activity. He was either a very good actor, or something more was going on here. The others seemed to share my apprehension. I watched Carl and my brother communicate wordlessly, both coming to the agreement that maybe this had gone far enough. At least that's what I thought they'd agreed upon. They never got the chance to express it. As everyone sat around stunned, the planchette began to move once more at its original achingly slow pace. I watched as it slid out from under Russell's fingers. Clearly, he was not the culprit. Seeing this, my brother then let go, followed by Carl. The planchette, however, kept moving. We looked on in disbelief, watching it move along of its own accord, aided not by human hands. The eye revealed to us the following letters: D, I, G. Again, it began a circuit of the board. D, I, G, D, I, G, D, I, G. Russell slammed his hand down upon the planchette, halting its movement, then instantly yanked his hand away with a cry of pain, wincing and with tears beginning to stream down his face. He drew his hand to his mouth and sucked on the fingers. "My hand!" he shouted. "It burned me!" On the board, in between the four of us, the planchette began to bounce violently back and forth from leg to leg at a rapid pace, making a sound like a spinning quarter beginning to falter. Outside, there came a tremendous boom, coupled with the searing light from an intense blast of lightning. On my right, just above eye level, the curtained window to the backyard was lit, a bluish square of bright, fuzzy light, casting shadows about the darkened room. In that moment of brief illumination from the corner of my eye, I could see the figure of someone standing in the backyard just outside the window. Carl, who sat with his back against the rear of the couch, facing the window, saw the image entirely. Holy! He sprang to his feet and vaulted over the couch behind him, while Russell, who had also seen the figure, fell backward into the corner of the couch and closet with a whimper, sucking on his burned fingers. Carl sped towards the lamp just beside the couch and hurriedly clicked it on, only it didn't come on. Now, knowing that what I thought I'd seen from the corner of my eye had actually been there, I too jumped to my feet, ran around the couch, and into the main area of the living room. "What the heck, guys?" Brandon shouted. He'd been seated with his back to the window and thus didn't see the figure standing outside in the storm, illuminated against the backdrop of night. I myself continued running through the living room past Carl, still trying to click on the lamp, and into the entry hall. There, I flipped the switch to the light in the entryway and the light in the dining room on my left, neither of which came on. Apparently, with the lights already off to enhance our candlelit session with the Ouija board, we'd missed the fact that the power had died. "Oh my God! Guys," I said, peeking my head back into the living room. The power's out." As I looked into the living room to inform the others of our dilemma, the back window once more flared with that electrical glow. I was now completely facing the window and could see, clear as day, the woman standing in our backyard just outside the window. Her hair was done up nice and neat in a style similar to something from an old-style TV show. She wore a white shirt or blouse with what appeared to be a blue apron over top. In that brief moment in which she was lit up, I couldn't make out her facial features through the rain-streaked window. Her face instead appeared all smeared and blurry. "Oh my God," I said again, pointing with a trembling hand towards the window. At the same time, I could hear a whimper coming from behind the couch, one that I was sure had been issued from Russell's finger-sucking lips. Now, standing upright, my brother took notice of my indication of the rear window, and finally turned to see what all the commotion was about. Though I could no longer see the woman from where I was, Brandon, being much closer to the window, apparently could. When he turned to see what it was that I was pointing at with such a look of terror spread across my face, he immediately jumped to his right, away from the window with a surprised shriek. "Oh crap! Oh crap!" he shouted as he tore towards me through the living room. "Who is that?" "Don't leave me!" Russell screamed from behind the couch. "Get up, you idiot!" Carl yelled as he made his way into the entry hall with my brother and me. "Quick," my brother said suddenly. "We have to lock the doors." Instantly, I jumped towards the front door and slammed on the bolt. Brandon took off through the dining room and into the kitchen to lock the door leading to the side yard, tripping and knocking over chairs along the way. Carl had run back into the living room to grab a couple of candles and was shouting for Russell to follow. He'd finally come out from behind the couch, shaking and in tears. After a few moments passed, and my brother had not come back, the other three of us left the entryway and headed towards the kitchen to find him and see what was going on. There, we found Brandon leaning over the sink, above which was a small pair of windows looking out into the backyard. In his hand was a flashlight, turned off, which he had apparently acquired from the kitchen junk drawer. We all gathered in the long, narrow kitchen and waited silently for him to report what he saw outside. "I don't see anything out there, guys," he said after a few moments of gazing through the glass. "I know I saw her," I said. "Her?" asked Carl. "Yeah, her," replied my brother. "I saw her too." He turned and looked back out the window, but I don't see her now. We stayed in the kitchen, huddled closely together, shadows shifting with dancing candlelight, just waiting for something to happen. Anything. For the power to come on, for my mother to come home, unlikely not for a few more hours, or maybe for one of my sisters to pay a visit. None of those things happened. Instead, just barely audible over the rain drumming across the roof and the continuous rumble of thunder, we heard a long, drawn-out, squeaky whine, like that of a rusty hinge coming from somewhere outside. It was followed shortly by a loud, metallic bang. "What the heck was that?" Carl asked. "I don't know," my brother answered him. "Oh God," Russell groaned. This isn't right." "Yeah, guys, I don't like this," I said, voicing my concerns. There was a feeling of impending doom that was slowly building, gaining momentum, spreading like a disease through the air, infecting us. We all could feel it, a creeping fear stronger than that by which each and every one of us had already been seized. We weren't in the clear. Something more was about to happen. From below our feet there arose a clatter accompanied by another metallic boom. "Oh no," my brother said. What? What is it?" I asked. "The storm cellar," he replied. We had forgotten about the storm cellar, a pair of green metal doors which sat just outside to the left of the living room window, at which the woman had been standing, and led downward into the basement. On my right, standing nearly ajar, was the door that led from our kitchen down into the dank, dark cellar. "Is it open?" Carl asked nervously. "We have to lock it," he said without waiting for a reply. Impulsively, Carl pushed his way by me, snatched the flashlight from Brandon's hand, and headed for the basement door. "No!" my brother and I both yelled, knowing that in all likelihood it was already too late to secure the basement. Carl flicked on the torch, swung open the door, and aimed the beam of light into the passage, then froze, staring open-mouthed into the darkness at something down the basement stairs. My brother jumped forward, knocking Russell to the ground, clutched Carl by the shoulders, and yanked him away from the top of the steps. The sudden action caused Carl to drop the flashlight, which came to rest at the top of the stairs. As my brother pulled Carl away, I sprang towards the door to shut it. At my feet, the dropped flashlight still emitting its beam pointed straight ahead into the pitch black of the cellar. I couldn't help but look directly ahead. The light refracted off of the steeply descending ceiling, illuminating faintly the damp wooden stairs below. At the bottom of the basement stairs, in a black puddle of trembling water, stood the woman. Water rolled off of her wet skin and soaked clothes, falling into the black puddle to cause ripples that sped away towards the puddle's edge in circles of reflected light. It was hypnotic. I watched in horror as the woman slowly leaned forward, farther and farther, until her face was little more than a foot away from the stairs. No human being could possibly lean forward at such a dramatic angle. In a twitchy and strange motion, the woman's head lifted so that she was staring directly at me. It was now her face that caught my attention, or rather the lack thereof. It was blank, blurry, and yet shifting as though I were still viewing it through a rainy window. The woman, still leaning forward, hovering parallel to the steps, then began to haltingly float upward towards me. The blue fabric from the apron she wore hung limp, dragging along the steps with a disquieting whisper. As she got closer, her feet dragging behind her thumped and scraped along with each and every step she passed. I could hear her toenails as they scratched slowly across the old warped wood. The dripping, faceless woman crept towards me, getting closer by the second. Then, from out of the deeply shadowed cellar behind her, stepped two children, standing side by side. On the left, a boy dressed in a suit stood up, staring at me with his hands perfectly straight on his sides. Next to him was a little girl of equal height, dressed like the woman who was now halfway up the stairs. The children's faces were grotesque, almost cartoonish, eyes far too big for their heads bulged from their tiny sockets, while below, their mouths were stretched into impossibly wide, maniacal grins, exposing equally unlikely teeth. Their skin was a pale, frigid tint of blue. The children remained at the bottom, just outside of the shadows, while the mother continued her ascent. As the woman got closer, I vaguely remember thinking that I could faintly hear her humming a lazy tune. "Sean, what are you doing?" I heard my brother shout out on my right. Then suddenly, there was a clutter, and the flashlight went spinning away, throwing the basement and the beings that occupied it back into unseen darkness. My brother had stepped in front of me, inadvertently kicking the flashlight in the process of taking me by the arm and pulling me away from the doorway. I recall feeling dazed. I suppose I must have been in some sort of trance. Throwing me out of the way, my brother spun back towards the door and slammed it shut. He then quickly slid the chain on the door into place, hopefully securing the basement. "What did you guys see?" Brandon asked, turning back towards Carl and me. A woman," Carl said. "And kids," I added. Carl shot a quizzical look towards me. It hit me then, what I just saw. "Oh my God, Brandon, we have to get out of here." My brother seemed prepared to argue until, with a final loud snap, the basement door popped open. Luckily, the chain held, and in that moment, the four of us scrambled over one another in a dash for the front door. On our way through the dining room, disoriented and shrouded in darkness, we clearly heard another loud snap, followed by the bang of the basement door crashing into the kitchen wall. The chain had given out. My brother, my cousin Carl, Russell and I spilled out of the house into the pouring rain, the roaring thunder, and the crackling lightning. We ran down our long, wooded driveway, out onto the street, and then ran some more. We finally stopped running once we made it to a brightly lit intersection, an oasis in the dark of night, where a nearby gas station offered shelter from the storm and hopefully a chance to find help. From there, we called my sister, told her we had seen someone in the house and asked her to pick us up, which she did. She took the four of us back to her apartment, and though we argued, knowing that we'd not just been victims of a family break-in, she called the police. They checked our house out, discovered signs of a possible break-in, but no perpetrators. The only things they found to verify our story at all were water trailing from the storm cellar doors through the basement, up the steps, into the basement door with the busted chain. However, they also encountered our Ouija board setup, which only helped to cast further doubt upon the reality of our story in the minds of the officers. The rest of that summer ticked by slowly, my brother and I taking it one day at a time, each of us unwilling to be left alone in that house. Eventually, though, once it was apparent that there would be no further activity, we were able to get back into a normal lifestyle. Nothing else of this magnitude ever happened in that house, and for years we had no answers. Was it a ghost we'd summoned through the Ouija board that was now set loose on the world? That was our best guess, but we had no clue until a few years later, that is. It turns out that Russell had known the whole time who these spirits were, where they had come from, and what they wanted. He'd seen them before, you see, many times, his whole life, in fact. Now, we didn't know it at the time and wouldn't find out until my brother entered middle school, but Russell and his family were thought of around town as weirdos. They were thought of as outcasts. This was due entirely to Russell's grandfather, who had once murdered a family in cold blood, a mother and her two children, a boy and a girl. The bodies had never been recovered. Russell's grandfather had been tried and sentenced to death, but apparently his punishment paled in comparison to what his family had gone through for years. Constant torment from the unrestful spirits of the family slain by the grandfather's hands. Around town it was just a story, one that the school kids told to scare each other and whispered about whenever Russell walked down the hall. a family haunted for eternity by vengeful spirits. But when Carl and my brother first heard it and then related it to me, we knew that it was no story. I never saw Russell again. He kept his distance from my brother after that, and they rarely spoke again, if ever. According to Carl, Russell and his family moved away a few years after the incident, no doubt taking the spirits with them. The bodies of the slain family, however, stayed behind where they were. Eventually, they were discovered buried on the property of Russell's old house, a house that once belonged to his grandfather. I don't know for sure, but I hope that maybe two families finally found rest that day. The awakened spirits of the slain family lingered, a chilling reminder of the unintended trespass into the supernatural. Unbeknownst to the friends, their innocent quest awakened more than mere spirits. It roused the tortured souls of a long-forgotten family, victims of a brutal crime. The Ouija board, now a relic, stood witness to their night of horror. Forever changed, the friends remain haunted by a shared nightmare that blurred the line between the living and the dead, leaving them to grapple with the consequences of their ill-fated curiosity. In the aftermath of our story, remember this: the Ouija's secrets are not to be trifled with. The veil between worlds is thin, and consequences darker than the night itself, and some mysteries are best left undisturbed. So sleep well if you dare.